This is my third attempt to say this material cleanly, I hope, and hopefully the successful version. So to begin is this quick review of terms backdrop and situation and scene. Pretty easy if we look at it fictionally, because scenes are what we see characters doing in locations and other things that may be occurring there and interacting with them. Effectively, a scene, the stuff in a scene is something, that can happen, that is occurring fictionally. So then we can expand that out and say, well, scenes occur inside a situation because part of the fictional situation are characters, locations, certainly the past, the backstory, and other things which are the context in which this scene is taking place. I mean, we may be in this room, but there is that other room over there. So our scene is in this room, but these two rooms are part of the whole situation. Okay, so from a fictional standpoint, the situation encloses a multitude of possible scenes, for example, in parallel or in sequence, not to mention the ones that have occurred in the past, which we see their remnants and effects now in the present. Okay, so far so good. The whole thing then is held or contained in this thing called backdrop, which is all the other things we know about, you might want to call it the world, very loosely speaking, for which this whole situation is a spot or a particular condition or a place on it, whatever that may be. Our scene right now is in an interrogation room. We are in the situation of a civil conflict, say in Bosnia, feeling 90s for some reason. And so the situation is this particular civil conflict in this particular location in Bosnia. And then our scene right now is occurring in an interrogation room. So far, so good. There could be plenty of scenes that go on in this general locale or this reachable locale and its own history and all the different characters who could be doing stuff in it. That's the situation. But the whole thing, the backdrop, is planet Earth, the 1990s. So even though Timbuktu is technically, there in our game, it's part of the backdrop. We're not doing anything that, invokes or, needs to take note of Timbuktu. Or for that matter, the planet Saturn. Those are all in the backdrop. So far, so good. Their enclosure outward or inward is easy to understand because that's how the characters see it. And in fiction, it's a very straightforward relationship. That's why in the picture, the biggest, thickest line is backdrop and then a thin line that has a situation. And you can imagine how there could be all sorts of little situations like scattered around, inside that big backdrop circle. And then inside one of those, and it's dotted because they're ephemeral, right? They come and go. The scenes, appear and then they disappear and there's new scenes. And you could be looking at this scene instead of that scene. And so that's why it's a dotted line there. Okay. That's the fiction. But as I said in that previous post, we are not orange, we are black. So when we look at role-playing procedurally, we see a completely different causal arrangement of these same concepts. So in this scheme, there's only one solid line, and that's situation. And it's a thick, solid line. I mean, that's the real thing. And then inside it, we do have scenes that are played. And note the causality. And it looks like it did in the orange, so that's not too hard, that since the scene can be thought of as a function of the situation, given this whole situation, and we're going to look at this character, well, where are they? Okay, boom, we're in a scene. So that's pretty easy. The other one may be a little trickier, in the sense that the backdrop is extremely intangible. It's a promise, for lack of a better word. It's way off there. And when we make a situation in which somebody appears or something happens that previously has been part of the backdrop or mentioned in the backdrop or assumed to be, we were even just told right now that it was part of the backdrop, but here it is in the situation. Now, it's not going back to the backdrop, okay? It's not backdrop anymore, and technically kind of never was. The backdrop's makeable only by becoming part of situation. It doesn't mean it can't be treated as, quote, real. Planet Saturn's out there in our little Bosnian interrogation story, but unless an alien from Saturn is in the situation, it remains backdrop. And the way that we make Saturn really part of our setting is for it to be relevant in the situation. Okay, that is the scheme. And what I really want to focus on is the part with situation and scenes, that the scenes are created by referring to situation. And however, things that happen in scenes can kind of respond and bump situation so that it changes. I want to talk about that next. These are new diagrams, and I'm kind of afraid of going into them while remaining in abstraction like this. So with your permission, I'm going to not jump into those diagrams with the scene and situations and kind of a zeroing in on that. I'm going to talk to you about this real game that we played. And it's a hack of a real game. The real game is Legendary Lives. I have messed with its resolution system and come up with a completely different fictional set of things for it, and basically sort of taken it and, Ron formed it into something that, as a joke, I call Whimsical Ways, because it sounds like Legendary Lives. Anyway, I've played it a couple times now. And I have learned that there's a way that one should generate situation for this game. There are many ways to generate situation in a given role-playing game in terms of what actually is making the situation. You could, for example, make up a situation or use instrumentation to do it, and then the player characters are made up independently of that and kind of get dropped in, and we see whatever interactions they're going to have, like right there in play. But there weren't many, if any, perhaps no, pre-existing relations or relevance of those characters to this situation, or vice versa, until this moment. Legendary Lives works better differently. That game doesn't have any instructions about that. So for Whimsical Ways, I'm taking what we learned as the best way and calling it, rules. So in this case, the rules for situation in Whimsical Ways is character-centric. To the point of kind of absurdity, in the sense that, well, I've got these characters. I guess this is the situation we're in, at least in part. So this somewhat loopy diagram that I've made here perhaps can show at least how I'm doing it. And as you can see, we begin on the left with the characters. So at the moment, the game master has no idea where this is going to be set. They don't have a pet spot. Well, I want to play them in this spot. Never mind all that. Not your job, not for this game. You look at the characters, and they come with two distinct kinds of things to investigate. The more complicated one goes up on top, and that is all of the details of the character. From Legendary Lives, Whimsical Ways maintains the property of a curious character creation system in which an enormous amount of it is random, and yet, given the order and given the decision points that you do have, creates a very much your character. And it finishes with you stating the character's goals. And those are not constructed at all. So you will state those. And so you end up with a character who's very vivid, full of backstory, just seeping and dropping like details everywhere. So I can't really generalize about it except to say that you've got a pretty potent little booger in every single one of these characters. And so basically it's just a matter of, first of all, looking at the different characters. And given the funky little map that I have, which is sort of conceptually similar to the one in Legendary Lives, it is strikingly easy to arrive at where this bunch of characters might be. And also in practice for the first session, kind of saying, well, and how would they be associated? I mean, there's a spectrum there. You would just have to do it every time you play the game for the first session, is to say, well, looking at these characters, at one end of the spectrum, they don't know anything about each other, and they're just all in the same region, all up to their own no goods of whatever sort. All the way to, this is a band of fire-forged chosen siblings who, have a drive and a sense of identity as a group, and they are here for their collective purpose. So there's that whole spectrum between the two that's possible. And all I can say is, given 3 or 4 Whimsical Ways characters, you look across them and it's pretty evident which one of those makes the most sense, and also where on the map. So you've kind of done this, and each one has also brought the potential for a whole bevy of non-player characters and problems and opportunities and things. Part of that was why you chose this location, but another part of it is to say, well, we can't have the entire circus of NPCs, across all of these characters involved, given where they are, and given, in the case of the first session, you're kind of looking at the end point of each of the lifeline sequences. And you would say, well, which NPCs, would seem rather proactive about this character at this time. And then you're looking at the location and also thinking, well, which of these NPCs, sort of makes sense to be right here. As I say, those might be sort of complementary decisions. And so you get an idea of how many of these NPCs are involved. So also, given the location, given those characters and given these non-player characters, it's not too hard to start thinking up a little bit about other non-player characters or groups or creatures or things of that kind. Now, you're mostly thinking in terms of backdrop now, because now you're kind of looking at the generalized picture, both of this location and also of the game in general. You might say, oh, well, this is going to be in this kind of province. Well, if we're in this kind of province, then this is what's going on. So now you're consulting the text, which is a little sketchy, getting creative about it, because now it's not going to be backdrop at all. We're here. So we're dealing with situation making. So that's the top row of all that kind of stuff. And then we have that bottom arrow. And this is something that I learned about Whimsical Ways in particular. As with Legendary Lives, there is a certain amount of weirdness that may be generated about the character and their background through the character creation process. It's not absolutely guaranteed, but just like family trouble or money trouble or enemies or religious crisis, it's pretty likely for somebody to crop up with weirdness, usually more than one. So anyway, what I mean by weirdness is all sorts of things. In Whimsical Ways, for example, in our game that we played recently, one of the characters had generated that they had been to a mysterious place that no one believes is real, but they've been there. And so it's on me to make this mysterious place. I have to think about it. I say, well, okay, what was it? I might say to the player, and the player might have a reasonably elaborate answer, or they might say, well, I don't know. I mean, something cool. So either way, I have to take it and make it my own. I have to know it. I have to like it, and I have to like look forward to its further freakiness impacting things. Particularly if a player character's goal concerns these things, which in this case it did. So you see that thing in the lifelines, and then you find out a little more about it, and you're thinking about what it is, and then you see that it's a player character's goal, and you're like, okay, it is very much on me that this weirdness, I can extend it, I can escalate it, I can say, oh, you've only glimpsed a corner and make up the other corners. I've got lots of room. I just have to be enthusiastic about it. And doubly so in this case, because in this case, the other player character had rolled out of almost 100 options among their lifelines the same item. And the players had quite reasonably looked at each other and said, oh, so that's how our characters met. So we travel together, and then they started talking about, they looked at their goals and they said, oh, well, this one's wants to go back and marry their lover, a wealthy religious leader. And this one wants to take news of the mysterious place, back to where they came from, not to mention kill someone there. And so then the other player said, oh, cool. Well, one of my goals is to help you get there. But we're going to stop off and I'm going to get married. It was just wrote itself that, okay, they're in the mountains of these creatures, that this first player character is one of, coming home from the journey. So all of this is, really straightforward, but it's on me to make the mysterious place pretty freaky. Another strange thing was, okay, first of all, one of these player characters played by Noah, called Theoxa Ag, is what I am now calling a Shkaza, which is a quadrupedal, semi-articulate front paw, big creature with a very humanoid face. They're carnivorous. They like to eat people and they like to eat other Shkaza. They're polite about it. And anyway, Theoxa Ag is one of these Shkaza, and so her lover is a high priestess, a wealthy priestess of the Shkaza in their home mountains, and so that's where we're headed. Now, the other player character turns out to be a robot, played by Helma, named 13, and the robot is quite invested in a number of things, as I said, about getting back home, and wants to correct the wrong that had marginalized her particular religious sect of robot and stuff like that. Well, anyways, one other thing that Noah had rolled for Theoxa was that Theoxa at some point had met someone who was her double, who was very much like her, and according to the rules of that item, it's just like you, except that they're a different race. So you have to go and roll on the same race table that you rolled on to start your character creation anyway. So Noah said, oh, I met a double and know another character a lot like Theoxa. Okay, rolls on that and gets a robot. Interesting. You already have a companion robot, but you meet this other robot who is like, just like you, mysteriously and eerily like you. Well, more weirdness. Being me and remembering that I can escalate weirdness, right? I don't have to stick with just that. This is just a little teeny package that Lifeline handed me. I don't want to ask them. I said, so what's up with this double? And they said, oh yeah, that double helped us find the mysterious place. Okay, so we're getting super weird. I, of course, thought to myself, well, we've got Shkaza traveling with a robot. The Shkaza is a specialist, which means they're an expert with a really exotic weapon. And the robot is a killer, effectively an assassin. And so that means, okay, we must have met the robot, who is themselves a specialist with a very similar weapon. Okay. And that means there must be another double who's a Shkaza, who's a killer. Okay, so I have the idea that we have this doubled, reversed pair of our player characters running around. And that's a good example of me escalating the weirdness. As far as escalating the weirdness of the other place is concerned, there's a lot more going on. These lifelines and character creation setups are just insane with possibilities. So the relic that Theoxa has stolen from another Shkaza, which has ancient magic in it, is embedded now in, her wicked super sword. And that relic, of course, since it has ancient magic, I'm thinking, okay, it's all connected, man. That relic is really important to the secret of the ancient of the place, the mysterious place. So I'm kind of loaded for bear on all that stuff. And there's other issues too, such as Theoxa had stolen from another Shkaza, had been imprisoned for it. They had stolen the relic. Her lover is a wealthy priestess. I look at the religions. I see that the Shkaza have several different sects, and the one that Theoxa had rolled for was the very churchy one. Oh, well, the lover is this wealthy priestess. Okay, super churchy, hotshot character. And now, of course, Theoxa is bringing this relic back. I'm kind of seeing there's a lot of room here, right, for different characters to care that Theoxa has come home for very different reasons. And it was very easy to say, okay, what is the religious situation with these people? Now, another factor in all of this is location per se. And I'm a map guy. When I say I'm thinking about the Shkaza, they're nomadic. So I'm thinking they have these semi-permanent encampments that are pretty much like little traveling towns because they follow fixed routes. And they're in these really hardcore mountains, right? Tons and tons of mountainous terrain and passes and bridges and gullies and, hidden peaks and cool little sequestered, valleys and stuff like that. I'm all over these mountains. So I go and I hit the internet, and nothing like, an internet's worth of battle map and location illustrations, to make your day. And I came away with very nice ideas of several different spots of relevance that this is where the Shkaza are encamped. And I was thinking, well, we've got the fancy ass side of the religion here. They've got to have like a cool temple. And I came up with a couple of different little insides of temples. And I was thinking, okay, those are set away. I came across a beautiful little place that I looked at, and I was thinking, this looks more like a human place. And I got to thinking more about how the enemy Shkaza had prominence in the community. And I came up with the idea, and this was on mine, thinking about this character. I said, aha, this one has a human meat camp. And so I thought a little bit about, how the Shkaza might have basically, opiated a bunch of humans and let them enjoy themselves. And then every so often, they pick a few for dinner. So, that's squicky and everything. But hey, we've got a robot in a Shkaza. We don't have to be human-centric in this particular story. So anyway, I've got all kinds of things going into this situation. And I want you to look at these words here. And I used them one time already. Impact. Location is one thing. The current standings of the different characters and their concerns is also a thing. But when our player characters are in this situation now, and in our case it's extremely literal because they have literally arrived, Theoxa with a new companion after a long absence. So there's a real nice demarcation. There isn't always, but in this case there is. Impact. How does everyone react? What does everyone want? That weirdness I talked about, it's got its own impact term, right? So that's what I mean by situation. If you look at the picture, you'll see that the brackets for situation, if you go over on the little diagram, you'll see that they, of course, include the sequence of scenes that are about to occur. obviously, but they also include those two impact words. So therefore, the whole situation is all of these things coming together in terms of impact in this location. And now we're going to play scenes. All right. So that's how I did it for Whimsical Ways. Now let's go back to that abstracted little set of boxes. I am uncertain as to whether I have put too much into each of these boxes, and maybe 6 or 7 of them might have been a better idea with different ideas in each one. Well, this first one, let's see if I can distract you to focus just on the part I want you to focus on. So the situation is this box, and we're going to look at the fact that we're going to have scenes because we're playing. But before we look at anything to do about the scenes, we should think about this situation as to whether it is relatively static or whether it has itself intrinsic changes that we can rely upon to happen just because the situation is what it is. To give you an example, if we had a very peaceful space station with no crises and no policy problems and no economic crunch, no wave of refugees, no, she's about to blow in the engine room, nothing, right? It's just the space station and everything's fine. And then we have characters at that space station and they have all sorts of trouble and problems and things like that. And so they're going to, change. Their scenes will change. But the station is kind of, fine. At least to start. And so that station would just have none of those arrows, those black arrows running across the top. I mean, it would just be fine the way it is. Its impact from scenes, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But in and of itself, left to itself, the station would be stable. Or we could have us instead in the starship. And in which case, and the starship is going from here to there. I mean, that's part of the situation, that we're in the starship and it's on its way from here to there. So, ipso facto, that's a changing situation. Again, left to itself, I'm not talking about things that may occur in the course of play. I'm talking more just about if there were no play and we just let the situation, blessedly free of scenes with characters in them causing trouble, what would it do? And in this case, it would change. It would go from here, and then a little while later, it would be there. A little while later, it would be there, and eventually, it'll be there. So those arrows running across the top are baked into the situation. Does that mean they can't change or be affected? No, I'm just talking about what it kind of would be like without scenes inside it. Okay, that's what those black arrows are. Probably should have had a diagram just with those, just to explain that. Now we go to those scene boxes. And the most important arrows for these scene boxes is that at the beginning of each one, we have to check into situation. We have to say, when we sort of open upon looking at characters in a place, whether it's the very first scene or some later time, there's some sort of little switch there, a little time lapse or a shift of attention or something. So we're in another scene, which just happens in role playing, no matter what, with or without formal rules for it, it happens. So we do stop and start scenes as fundamental to play. So at that moment, there is a check-in to situation to say, okay, so that whole situation, remember the other room, other places that are in the situation, other people who are in the situation, who we weren't looking at in the previous scene, or we weren't thinking about them much. But hey, what about all of those? And also the people who were in the previous scenes. I mean, now they're in new now, so they may be up to something. So we look at that whole situation and we say, given the opening of this scene, who's there, who cares about who's there and what's there, and what are the circumstances in every possible way. thinking of the scene as an expression of the situation as it now stands. So every scene begins with a check-in to the overall situation, is what I'm saying. That the A arrows, they're fixed. You're going to start a new scene, bam, there's an A arrow from situation doing something right there. Now, the other thing to look at now is inside the scene, its own little set of black arrows. And that, thank God, finally, we're just talking about the role-playing. We're talking about characters walking and talking. We're talking about traps springing open. We're talking about, opening a closet and the skeleton falls out. We're talking about how many, critters or critter-like people are, hiding somewhere so they can jump out and stab you. We're talking about the backstory and its impact on things, the aforementioned skeleton, any number of stuff like that. We're talking about what your character does. You go over to the Duchess and you either say, Mom, or you, depending on your character's backstory, or you say, prepare to die, depending on if it's a different backstory. But you're going to interact with the Duchess, and the Duchess may have things to say about that, or do, so the arrows move. That's why there's more than one arrow in there. Things change as we go along inside these scenes. When the scene closes, sooner or later, all scenes must close. Kind of like what my wife says, sooner or later, all bleeding stops. Anyway, when that moment comes, there's that blue arrow because there is a distinguishable shift from scene to scene. However it is coded in that particular game, whether it's formalized by a rule or whether it is something like, okay, we're done with this room, we're going down the corridor and we're going to open the next door, right? Whatever it is that demarcates this concept of scene from one to the other. That's that blue thing. Good. Anything else in this diagram to look at? Yes, there is. Because sometimes, and I drew it for the second scene, but it could be in any scene or absent from a scene, is the notion that the situation, instead of merely contributing to the opening of the scene, may have enough things going on in it that either as triggered by an event or as inevitable given the circumstances or whatever else may be involved as procedure, some aspect of the situation, sticks its nose into the scene while it is in play. So it didn't do it in the beginning of the scene. It does it a little later in the scene. So that's why that B arrow is there, because depending on the situation, depending on the nature of the scenes, that is a viable phenomenon that does sometimes occur. All right, so I'm trusting everybody has internalized this diagram, isn't disoriented by it, nor is this some exotic rules set or set of terminology. I'm kind of just talking about every single role-playing game I have ever played. And the only really complicated part is the one that I talked about in the beginning, which is that the situation itself either is nice and stable, in which case these, scenes occur and we just check on the stable situation, at the beginning of each one. And then in that case, the only serious changes of play are coming via the blue arrows. Or we could have the slight nuance, doesn't change anything about process, but it changes a lot about content, where the situation fundamentally has intrinsic change, kind of built into it as it's going along, that pending no interference, that will be occurring. So therefore, what intrudes itself upon, like arrow A the first time has content, but since the situation is changing in this case, arrow A the second time will look different. Okay, we're good, I hope, with all of that. Take that one away with you. And now we talk about another interesting possibility, which may occur. So this is the same diagram, and I took out the arrow B because it has served its purpose in our conversation. And here I draw your attention to this great big arrow going, for lack of a better word, the wrong way, which is a perfectly good thing, not a bad thing, because what happened in the scene is significant enough to change the situation. So having reunited with your mom, the Duchess, and through the events of the scene have suddenly been, named the heir to, all that treasure or something. Lots and lots of people in the whole situation, some of whom weren't even there, are going to care about this. So, therefore, the situation has changed due to the events of the scene. So we have that big arrow, shooting back up, hitting the situation, and as you can see, changing its color. So therefore, when we get our new A coming into the next scene, it's not just that the situation had bumped along on its own trajectory of change, like the literal trajectory of the spaceship. No, you changed it. The scene changed it. We are in a whole different situation. A fine example, Duchess's aside, a fine example would be that in our spaceship situation, someone sabotaged the engines in the course of those scenes, and now the spaceship is lazily spinning instead of zipping along, and it's headed into, that gas giant. That's a very different situation. And so therefore its impact, the new A on the new scene, is going to look considerably different than the impact of the old situation on the old A in the previous scene. Okay? That's our little schema of thinking about it. We could have scenes that just go along, affecting one another linearly without really impacting the situation as a whole much. We also could have a situation which is changing on its own without reference to the scenes, or being very stable in that regard. Or sometimes we can have scenes that respond to the situation, and the situation is thereby changed. This doesn't change anything about the fundamental processes, which is that once you close a scene and a new scene starts, you're checking into the situation to see what's there. So that is our scheme here. And my next step will be to take us through our game of Whimsical Ways with all these ideas in mind. Say, well, what did happen and which arrow is occurring right there? See, there it happens. Right? That's what I'm looking forward to.